I just wanted to start. Firstly, thank you very much to Helen, and thanks very much to the Cumbria Wildlife Trust for inviting me to speak this evening. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about temperate rainforests in Britain in general, and then handing over later to Izzy to talk a little bit about the Skiddaw Rainforest Restoration and Habitat Restoration Project. And then we'll obviously have time for questions and comments. So I just wanted to kick off by sharing this slide, which the backdrop of which is the front cover of my book, The Lost Rainforests of Britain. And although it looks very realistic, it looks like it could be potentially a photo, it's actually a watercolor painting by the fantasy artist Alan Lee, who is most famous for illustrating the works of Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and so on. And he actually won an Oscar for art direction on the Lord of the Rings movies when they were made in the early 2000s. And I obviously loved the Lord of the Rings growing up as a kid and as an adult. And I particularly loved Alan Lee's illustrations, not just of the kind of the stories of Tolkien, but also of kind of fairies and goblins and all sorts of myths and legends. And when I started living in Devon about 4.5 years ago, I discovered that Alan Lee actually lived up the road from me in a little village called Chagford. And it turned out that he'd moved to Devon and to Dartmoor in the 1970s and been really inspired by the really wet, gnarled woodlands that he'd found growing on the edges of Dartmoor. Woodlands that we now come to recognize as being temperate rainforests. And if you go back through some of his illustrations for the Lord of the Rings, like places like Fangorn Forest and Mirkwood, actually a lot of these are temperate rainforest trees that are inspired by parts of Dartmoor and habitats that he was finding on the edges of Dartmoor. So I thought it would be wonderful to ask him, alongside interviewing him for the book, I wanted to ask him if he would illustrate the front cover of my book, and he wonderfully said yes. So a childhood dream absolutely come true. But to move from fantasy to reality, we do genuinely have temperate rainforests in this country. Britain is actually a rainforest nation, and that might sound like a fantastical thing to say, but it's absolutely true. And here is an example of one. This is Black Tor Copse in the middle of Dartmoor. It's one of 3 ancient Atlantic oak woods that still exist high up on Dartmoor, high up on the moor. And I just love going and exploring these places and sort of looking at the incredible plethora of mosses and lichens that are growing on the octopus-like limbs of these ancient oak trees. And, you know, we're perhaps familiar with the idea of rainforests in tropical areas, tropical rainforests. These are areas of the world, like the Amazon, Congo Basin, and Indonesia, where the climate is rainy but hot. But we also have temperate rainforests slung around the world in the temperate zones, in places like the Pacific Northwest of America, in New Zealand and Tasmania, parts of Japan, parts of Chile and Argentina, but also the Atlantic seaboard of the British Isles. And actually, Britain has one of the best climates in Western Europe for temperate rainforest to thrive. And although, you know, again, this might sound like a kind of romantic concept, the idea of rainforests in Britain, they are actually ecosystems that have been understood and studied and named as such for some decades now. And there have been studies going on of temperate rainforests around the world for many decades. So, you know, I think what I found fascinating about this was that this is a concept that's understood by some scientists, botanists, ecologists, but until perhaps relatively recently, I think it's fair to say that there hadn't been such widespread public understanding and awareness of them, and there hadn't been political attention given to their protection and restoration either. So I've given you one example there of a temperate rainforest, one that is predominantly oak wood, but there are also other species of trees that you find in our temperate rainforests. They're perhaps, it's true to say, they're less defined by purely the species of tree and more by the climatic conditions and what we'll come on to in a bit, some of the other plants that grow on the trees. But But I just wanted to give you another example here of some of the species that you can find in temperate rainforests. You can also find hazels. In fact, you can find entire hazel woods in some parts of the Atlantic seaboard of Britain, and particularly in the west coast of Scotland, in parts of Argyll. There are these incredible hazelwoods, Atlantic hazelwoods, places like Ballachuan, hazelwood on the Isle of Seal, which is just incredible, very, very ancient, possibly some of the most ancient woodland that we have left in Britain, perhaps dating back to shortly after the last ice age. And because of that longevity of ecosystems being being there continuously, they've obviously become very complex and accrued huge numbers of species that grow within them and on them. And I think this is really where I want to get onto next is what really defines temperate rainforest, what makes it special, what gives it its characteristics is not so much the trees, but the plants that are growing on the trees, the plants that grow on other plants, which we call epiphytes. And these are not parasitic, they're not taking energy from the tree or causing their host to die in any way or to be cause harm, but actually they're just simply using the tree as a form of scaffolding, essentially. And they are getting enough of their water and nutrients from the rainwater and from the air and thriving in these very, very wet conditions that we find in the west of Britain. And to give you a few examples of what I mean by epiphytes, these plants that grow on other plants, here is one quite common example, polypody fern, a really beautiful fern that can often be found growing along branches and in some cases on sort of stone walls and on boulders. But I love kind of finding instances of this and kind of looking at it through when the sun is shining through it really strongly. You get the sort of translucent effect, the sort of green halo around trees. This is an example I found on growing on Dartmoor, but you can see it across the western seaboard of the UK. And here's another type of fern that you can find growing in our temperate rainforests, a much, much smaller fern. It's called filmy fern, and it gets its name from the fact that actually the fern itself is basically only sort of a cell wall thick at the edges of its fronds. And so you can it's really translucent. It really, really particularly thrives in the wettest parts of these woodlands, often growing on or near waterfalls or in streams, or these sort of great mats of filmy fern alongside mosses and lichens and particularly liverworts, which are these amazing kind of lower plants, they're often called, which I think really does them down, and I think explains to some extent why they've been overlooked for so long and perhaps aren't so widely recognised by people. But I think they're absolutely wonderful. I've really become fascinated by the kind of the detail of these habitats, the fact that there are basically ecosystems, entire ecosystems growing on a single branch, and then you can find within this sort of mass of green infinite worlds of detail and diversity. But if you really want to get into temperate rainforests, I'm afraid you're going to have to become a total lichen geek. And that's what I've found myself becoming over the last few years. I should stress that I'm very much an amateur naturalist. I'm not a trained ecologist. But certainly, up until a few years ago, I'd probably say I was kind of quite myopic towards plants, kind of suffering from what is often termed plant blindness, a sense that we don't really recognize the diversity of plants around us. But I've got much more into it in recent years. I've come to appreciate more the amazing wealth of species that we have, particularly, as I say, in our temperate rainforests. And here is an example of a wonderful lichen, one of my favorites, tree lungwort, Lobaria pulmonaria, which gets its name from the medieval doctrine of signatures, which is this old belief held in the Middle Ages that plants and fungi took on the forms of the illnesses they were meant to cure in the human body. So lungwort, meant to cure lung diseases, pneumonia and so on, and coughs and colds, because if you look at it, it sort of looks a bit like the inside of a human lung. But I think it looks a lot more actually like the scaly wing of a dragon. And I love finding examples of it. It's very rare these days. It used to be much more widespread, but still particularly can be found in the clean air and wet conditions of our temperate rainforests. Here's another amazing, although possibly slightly disgusting looking lichen, which looks really like a Doctor Who monster. I absolutely love finding this. This is Labaria, sometimes called Rickesolia virens, a cousin of tree lungwort, even more viridian green in its colours. And when you look at it close up through a hand lens, which is what I've done in the little pull-out box in the corner here, it really does look like a kind of Doctor Who bug-eyed monster. And again, this is very oceanic, meaning it can only really be found in the maritime west of Britain. And so it's a good indicator that you're potentially standing in a temperate rainforest if you find this very rare lichen. Another lichen species in our temperate rainforests, less exciting to look at maybe, but pretty astonishing if you get to smell it, because this is Sticta sylvatica. And if you gently give it a gentle rub and smell it, it actually smells like rotting fish, which I don't really understand any sort of evolutionary reason for that being the case. But there you go, that's what it does. Here growing by a stream on Bodmin Moor, found this just over the Christmas break. And again, another wonderful indicator of the wet woodlands that we have. But it's not just about lichens, it's also about fungi. Here is another particularly weird denizen of our temperate rainforests. This one's called hazel gloves fungus. It grows, as the name suggests, on hazel, but it can also be found growing on blackthorn, as the other photo here shows. And it actually is parasitizing another fungus, which is called glue crust fungus, which can be found gluing together bits of dead blackthorn and bits of dead hazel. And it's a real fungus eat fungus world out there in our temperate rainforests. They love eating each other, these funguses. This one I think is particularly cool because it's just so obviously weird and charismatic. Somebody, I feel a bit bad about saying this now because unfortunately he's back in power, but somebody said to me once that they thought that hazel gloves fungus looks like Donald Trump's tiny orange hands. So there's an image for you to take away from this evening's talk. But of course, moving beyond lichens and mosses and fungi, there are obviously huge numbers of other species that are supported in our temperate rainforests. You know, birds like pied flycatchers, redstarts, wood warblers, insects like the blue ground beetle, pictured here in the upper right corner. And of course, there are species that are missing from large parts of our ecosystems, but ought to be returned, and hopefully, and in some cases are starting to be returned, like pine marten. Very excited that the Devon Wildlife Trust is starting to reintroduce pine martens to this part of the eastern edge of Dartmoor recently, and wildcat, which are obviously now often only found in very small parts of Scotland, but really could do with reintroducing them to other parts of Britain. And temperate rainforests aren't only important for their biodiversity. I think they're also important for the carbon they lock up. Of course, all woodlands are important for that. All woods are locking up carbon from the atmosphere in the woody matter that makes up their trunks and branches and in the forest floor. But I think there might be something going on in our temperate rainforests in addition to that, which is the carbon that potentially is being locked up in the epiphytes and the plants that are growing on the branches of the rainforest trees themselves. And this is a phenomenon that's been studied to some extent in tropical rainforests, where ecologists have tried to kind of measure the carbon uptake of these epiphytes. And so far, I don't think there's been any particularly detailed or conclusive studies being done of temperate rainforests in this country. But it seems to me, looking at this example here of a branch, again, taken along the Dart River down here in Devon. But there's such a mass there of plants and roots, kind of rhizomes of the ferns, and the mass of all the mosses that have lived and died on that same branch, forming a kind of almost like a soil in the canopy of the trees. Seems to me that something is going on there that perhaps is worth studying, and certainly is worth protecting. And another reason why we should be protecting our temperate rainforests for the contribution they make to the fight against climate change. I'm also fascinated by temperate rainforests because I think they're really culturally and historically important. Because when I started looking into this, I sort of realized that actually you could see almost the kind of ghosts of temperate rainforests in some of our myths and legends, particularly Celtic myths and legends, which obviously are often found in the west of Britain, particularly in Wales, where we have the wonderful Mabinogion, or book of collected Welsh mythology, Celtic Welsh mythology, that dates back at least 1,000 years when it was first written down, but perhaps also goes back a lot further into kind of oral history that dates back to the Celtic era. And if you read the Mabinogion, you'll see that the first four books of it are actually called the first four branches of the Mabinogion. And a lot of the stories within them contain references to trees, and particularly oak trees. So there's a character who features in a lot of the stories of the Mabinogion, for example, who is called Gwydion. He's a shape-shifting wizard, and his name actually can translate as born of trees. And he casts his magical spells to takes flowers of the oak trees, flowers of the meadow sweet, and flowers of the broom, fashions a whole woman out of flowers called Gladoweth, who features in one of the other stories in the Mabinogion. So, I think there's lots of amazing things about our temperate rainforests ecologically, in terms of their impact that they can have on helping to resolve climate change, or at least start to mitigate its impact, and in terms of their heritage value as well. So where do we actually find temperate rainforests in Britain? I've given you a hint by talking a lot about the west of Britain, but to kind of give that a bit more flesh, here's a map that I've made with a friend and a mapping specialist called Tim Richards, of our temperate rainforest zone in this country. And this is based on work that was previously done by someone called Professor Christopher Ellis, who works in Scotland at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. And he published a paper back in 2016 trying to kind of map the temperate rainforest zone in Britain for the first time. And Tim and I just basically tried to update his assessment by getting some more recent data from the Met Office, looking at rainfall records and temperature records, combining them together to create this map here. The map shown on the left, which is the sort of slightly more colourful map, giving you a sense of basically how wet the west coast of Britain is. The greens, the green coloration, definitely wet, but as you get into the blues and even into the purples, really, really, really wet. So there you go. That's why parts of Cumbria and the west coast of Scotland in particular, and Snowdonia, Eryri in North Wales, are very, very rich places for temperate rainforest. Unfortunately, however, that just simply tells you the sort of climatic zone, the envelope in which these wonderful habitats can exist and have existed in the past. And that covers an area which is about 20% the size of Britain. But alas, today we have far, far less of that habitat actually left. And if you look at the ancient woodlands that you can find in those parts of the country and use that as a bit of a proxy for temperate rainforest, it turns out that they cover less than 1% of Britain. So how have we gone from having an ecosystem that maybe, thousands of years ago, after the Ice Age through to kind of Bronze Age times, covered about a fifth of this country, down to something that is less than 1% of Britain nowadays? I'll come on to the reason why in a minute, but just to show you this slide, and if you want to have a look at maps of temperate rainforests in more detail, you can get it via this link, and you can zoom in, as I have here, on Cumbria to have a look at surviving temperate rainforest fragments or potential temperate rainforest fragments in your neck of the woods, and also explore whether there are publicly available records of some of those lichens and mosses and bryophytes that I was talking about earlier. But why have we lost so much of our temperate rainforest habitat? Well, one of the reasons is, sadly, that we cut them down. This isn't actually a photograph from the Bronze Age, because funnily enough, they didn't have photographs back then, but it is a photograph of somebody reenacting what likely went on in the Bronze Age, which was, of course, a lot of forest clearance. It was being done by farmers and settlers who were trying to simply, create lands that they could farm on, they could eke a living from, I can only get so angry about that happening 5,000 years ago. But what I can get, I think, a bit more justifiably annoyed about is the fact that some of our temperate rainforests were felled as recently as the 20th century, and bizarrely in the name of planting trees. They were felled in pursuit of putting up conifer plantations, as this example here from Devon shows you. This is a plantation of conifers that was planted in the Tean Valley, a place called Fingal Bridge, Fingal Woods, which today is owned by, I think it's owned by the Devon Wildlife Trust and by the National Trust, and they've combined to try and restore it to some of its former glory. But very sadly, that a lot of our temperate rainforests were felled, as with other examples of our ancient woodlands, in the 20th century. In fact, we lost about a third of our ancient woodland just in the 3 decades between 1950 and 1980, according to Oliver Rackham, who's one of the greatest historians of our woodlands. And that sort of arc of destruction that took place across vast swathes of Britain has left us with much impoverished ecosystems. When you look at some of the biodiversity that these conifer plantations support nowadays. However, the good news about them is that if they're restored quickly enough, you can often find that there are some remaining species of plants and trees that are still surviving in the seed bank, in the earth beneath the plantations. So there is hope for restoring some of our temperate rainforests, that even those that have been cut down entirely. But time is ticking, and a lot of these plantations do need to be ultimately brought back into being broadleaf deciduous woodland. So another threat to our temperate rainforests is, I am afraid, the ever-present sheep. And you've heard of rainforest beef destroying the Amazon. Well, this is our own version. It's rainforest mutton. Sheep are a non-native species in Britain. They obviously have been here for many thousands of years, but it got to particularly high levels during the 20th century in response to government subsidies and modern intensive farming that increased their numbers enormously. And sheep are a bit of a problem when it comes to encouraging the natural regeneration of trees, because they are selective browsers, and when there's nothing else to eat, they'll certainly eat young saplings. So not only do they nibble grass down to a very tight kind of billiard table sward, they will also eat young oak saplings, young rowans, and so on. And that will prevent the natural regeneration and spread of deciduous woodlands, and including our temperate rainforests. If you're perhaps slightly unconvinced that sheep are the big problem I'm making them out to be, I'd like to try and dissuade you of that by showing you this map, which is a lovely map of sheep density in Europe. You can see the areas in yellow are lower densities of sheep, and the areas in dark red are those with the highest densities of sheep. And from this map, you can see we are truly world-beating when it comes to numbers of sheep. Another map, just to really hammer home the point that where there are large numbers of sheep, there also happen to be large numbers of, the potential for a large amount of rainforest. And in some ways, this isn't a coincidence, because as any farmer in the west of Britain will tell you, the West Country is really good for growing grass. The problem is it's also really, really good for growing temperate rainforest. And this is kind of one of the problems we have to contend with if we're to see regeneration of some of our wonderful temperate rainforests in this part of the world. Perhaps we can have a fewer sheep and a bit more temperate rainforest, because when you allow any woodland to become so overgrazed that it can't regenerate and it doesn't have new young trees coming forth, tends to be what happens to them. This is an example of a woodland, a temperate rainforest, in fact, in Scotland, that is essentially dying on its feet. This one happens to be composed mostly of birch trees, but having sent out thousands and thousands and thousands of airborne seeds to try and regenerate and replenish themselves, these birch trees have seen all of their young saplings, essentially nibbled to death, not just by sheep in this instance, but also by the large numbers of deer that we've allowed to kind of get out of control, particularly in the Highlands of Scotland, because of any absence of natural predators and inadequate culling. And so, what you end up with is very old trees, wonderful in themselves, but, poor age structure to these woods. They're not bringing forth fresh saplings. And you end up with many small fragments of temperate rainforests kind of marooned in the midst of essentially kind of wet deserts, where they are lacking ecological connectivity, unable to really spread any further than they've been sort of languishing at in their tiny islands. I'll give you one last depressing slide before moving on to the hope, which is this. There is one other threat that we really have to be conscious of in our temperate rainforest, which is invasive species, and in particular this one invasive species, which is Rhododendron ponticum, which became very popular in Victorian gardens and as game cover for pheasant shoots, but has really got out of control in many of our wet woodlands in the west of the country in particular. That particularly loves the wetness of the west of Britain, and when Rhododendron ponticum gets away, it just completely smothers the habitat. It will, because it's evergreen and its leaves are green obviously all year round, it's shading out the ground flora, it's shading out young saplings trying to come through. And as you can see here at this example, at Shipley Bridge up on Dartmoor, it's really kind of has completely destroyed what was a thriving temperate rainforest ecosystem along this river. The government have been not doing nearly enough to tackle it. There are obviously sterling efforts by NGOs, by wildlife trusts, of course, around the country, by national trusts, by others, to try and eradicate it from places where it has got out of control. But I think it really needs some more support and direction from the government and more funding, to be honest, to pay landowners and organisations to help get rid of it. In fact, at current rates of investment, I calculated it could take about 250 years to completely clear the huge areas of Rhododendron ponticum that we have in England. So we really need to be getting a move on, and I think that requires political action as well as the great work that's being done by conservation groups. But enough of me being depressing. I do want to leave you with this sense of hope, because there really is lots of hope around our rainforest restoration project. The fact that we still have these amazing fragments of this habitat scattered across Britain like constellations of stars means that they are able to effectively be lifeboats. They are there as reservoirs of these amazing species, and that are ready to spread again if we give them half a chance. And there are, of course, plenty of natural processes ready to kick back in if we kind of alleviate some of the pressure that we've put on our ecosystems. Natural processes like natural regeneration, for example, the natural regeneration of trees and of other plants. Jays are, as pictured here, are nature's greatest tree planters. And they're particularly important, of course, for oak trees, where, the heavy acorns aren't carried by the wind and who tend to fall close to the mother oak and end up not being able to do well under the shady canopies of their mother trees. But there are loads of studies that have shown how amazing jays are at spreading oak trees and spreading acorns far and wide. There was a recent study done of natural regeneration of an area of abandoned farmland next to oak woodland at a place called Monk's Wood, which is in Cambridgeshire, not a temperate rainforest part of the country, but nevertheless an old oak woodland. And it was next to arable farmland, completely bare land, no vegetation on it, and it was fenced off for a couple of decades. And the studies that were done of it showed that in just 23 years, the fenced off farmland had reached 86% vegetation cover, most of which was oak trees, and it was being spread a lot by jays, as well as by things like squirrels and mice and so on. So, sometimes we need to plant trees, sometimes we just need to let nature do the job for us. But of course, we do sometimes need to intervene still, because a limiting factor on natural regeneration is grazing by livestock and sometimes by deer as well. And here is what I think is quite a dramatic example of how a simple fence put up this hillside in Eryri in Snowdonia in North Wales has seen a dramatic impact on the sorts of vegetation you're getting on one side of that fence versus the other. So you can see here There's a fence up the middle of the picture. On the left, sheep can still graze, even though it's a steep slope. You still get up there. But on the right, there's the sheep are excluded, and not only are there lots of rowans that have become self-seeded there by birds dropping the berries, but there's also loads more heather, loads more bracken, loads more bilberry, no doubt, creating this much, much richer habitat growing up the hillside. And so, this is a good example of quite an easy intervention, just putting in a fence, single exclosure fence. You can do sort of similar things now, without using fencing, if you fit what's sometimes referred to as no fence or GPS collars to cattle and sheep that are grazing in that area, and you can essentially program in where they can graze and where they aren't allowed to graze. So lots of exciting experiments being done with things like that these days. I think to restore our temperate rainforests, we do need also political action. We need the government to be caring about this as well as the rest of us. And so it was really good to see, after years of campaigning by a number of organisations, including the Wildlife Trust, of course, the government did end up publishing a plan to recover England's temperate rainforests. Now, I should emphasise it was only a fairly short document and only first steps towards doing something of this scale. But it was really good to see the government actually paying attention to this habitat, which I think has been overlooked by politicians for so long, and kind of giving it some of that recognition that I think it deserves. Because, to be quite honest, we really ought to be kind of shouting across the world about how much an amazing habitat this is, and how really we ought to, as a country, be taking really much greater responsibility for it, much greater care of it, because it is really rare globally. There's perhaps less than 1% of the world's surface is covered by temperate rainforest. Even adding in everything that's in the Pacific Northwest of America and some of the larger areas of temperate rainforest that still exist around the world. It's really, really important that Britain does its part as well in protecting and restoring this wonderful habitat. In fact, even more encouragingly, there was a recent study done, I think, by Leeds University that suggested that, of course, climate change is going to have an impact on this habitat, as with every other habitat around the world and as with all parts of human society. But that actually, if we constrain global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees, that actually the temperate rainforest zone in Britain shouldn't shrink that much, should be broadly what it is still today. And that actually we have some of the greatest potential on Earth for restoring this temperate rainforest habitat here in these Isles, which is why it's absolutely amazing to see this project taking off in Cumbria, the Skiddaw Temperate Rainforest Restoration Project, and obviously restoring other habitats as well. But I don't know anything about that. I'm going to hand over to Izzy to talk about that. So I'll wrap this up with just one last ask for all of you, which is, of course, cheekily, to buy my book. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Guy. Just going to get my slides up.
I'll just try and escape from this. Sorry. Yeah, you're up. Yeah, excellent. And
then we just wait for the tech to slowly work.
Very slowly. I'm sure I'll get there in a second. Thank you for that, Guy, by the way. I can really see myself becoming a lichen geek. I like that description a lot, so I'm going to keep that one.
excellent.
Just a reminder as well, everybody in the audience, if anybody does have any questions for Guy or Izzy, please do pop them in the chat and we'll hopefully get to them at the end. If anybody does want to ask Guy a question now while we're waiting for Izzy to hopefully return, then please go ahead. Yeah, there's a few more lichen geeks in the chat. We should make a Facebook group or something.
Um, Deer are a big problem in Cumbria too, and rhododendron. Oh dear. Okay.
Yeah, I think they're a big problem everywhere.
Yeah.
Janet's asking how many decades, I guess how many decades old the trees need to be to support epiphytes. Don't know if you know that.
Gosh. It depends very much on the species. I have seen some oak trees on Bodmin Moor, which are probably were planted about 30 or 40 years ago, and they're getting some of the string of sausages lichens, which you might be familiar with. I didn't actually show them in the talk, but they're these wonderful kind of beard lichens that grow particularly well in the west of England. Sorry, certainly in Cornwall and Devon. Sorry, I don't know if they thrive so well in Cumbria. But if you're talking about some of those labarian species, so tree lungwort, the Labaria virens I showed you earlier, some of them are very, very, very fussy about where they grow, about the light conditions they grow in. They are basically indicators of ancient woodland because they take such a long time to kind of reproduce and spread within a wood. So you're in a pretty special place if you can find them. And obviously under no illusions about how long this could take to really, really restore temperate rainforest at sort of
long-term job. Yeah, thank
it's
you.
a very long-term job. It's definitely, this is a multi-generational sort of hundreds of years project, really. But we have to start, don't we?
Thank you.
No worries. Somebody's asked if I'll add Ireland to my book for the second edition. Well, I don't have to actually, and because there is another wonderful book about Ireland's temperate rainforests by a chap called Owen Dalton. So I recommend his book as well. He's just brought out another book, I think, on temperate rainforests, which is sort of a kind of lovely coffee table photo book of some of the kind of temperate rainforests of places like Killarney National Park in Ireland, which is definitely well worth a visit as well, even though it's also overrun by rhododendron, unfortunately.
I think we might just have gotten Izzy back. Izzy, are you there?
Yes, my screen froze as soon as I put the PowerPoint on, and then my laptop crashed. So I think that was too much for it.
Oh dear. Okay. Shall I try and share it on my screen instead?
Please do.
Okie dokie. We'll get there, folks. Can everybody see that? Yep.
Yes.
Okay, I'll just pop it on full screen. Great, and let me just, Izzy, if you just want to let me know when to change slide and I'll do that for you, okay? Izzy? Oh dear, I think she might have frozen again. Guys, if there's any more questions in the chat that you'd like to answer, now might be an amazing time for that.
For sure. Let me go back to them. So the wetter climate may help with the recolonization of some of these species. Any thoughts on that? I guess the problem with climate change, as we're experiencing it, is that it's just becoming more extreme, and extremes of both torrential downpours, but also extremes of hot summers and hot dry summers as well. So, I think it was a couple of years back now when we had a particularly hot dry summer, kind of temperatures hit 40 degrees in some parts of England. And, I think I visited some temperate rainforests that summer and just to see how they were faring. And, they were surviving, but they were looking pretty kind of crispy around the edges, if I'm honest. I think there was a report even in Cornwall along the Helford River, which is a very, very wet river, wet woodland there, sorry, which features in some of Oliver Rackham's books about ancient woodland. And I think there had actually been a wildfire that had broken out there, obviously probably been sparked by someone foolishly leaving a barbecue or a blaze or something like that, but that the wood had become so tinder dry that it had actually caught fire. Luckily, they did catch it in time, so it didn't become a massive wildfire. But I think that's the scary thing, really, is that there are instances where this could become a real problem for some of our temperate rainforests if we get drier and drier and hotter summers. But as I said, there's this Leeds University study that recently came out that does seem to suggest that within, if we keep global warming to within certain thresholds, that we could be okay for some of our temperate rainforests. So none of talking about natural carbon sinks is any sort of excuse for letting up on slashing emissions to zero by basically yesterday. So we have to absolutely keep going on that as well.
Thanks, Guy. So we do have an Izzy back again. I'm going to share my screen again, Izzy, and hopefully this time everything will be okay.
Yeah. If it doesn't, because the PowerPoint's too much, I can always just give a brief general talk without the presentation.
I think hopefully it'll be okay. It seems to be working fine at my end. So yeah, just give me a shout when you want to change the slide. Okay.
Yeah, so it's working for me now. So Skiddaw Forest, which we have now purchased, thanks to everyone's amazing donations, is England's highest nature reserve. Can you change the slide, please? So this is Skiddaw. It absolutely towers over Keswick, and you get lovely views over Derwentwater and Bassenthwaite. And so the area of land that we've purchased is known as the Back of Skiddaw, and it covers around 1,200 hectares or 12 square kilometres. And it does include the summit of Skiddaw, but also Great Calver, Little Calver, and some smaller fells as well, including Sale Howe. And the current habitat there is sort of a mixture of acid grassland, blanket bog, and heathland. Next slide. So we've got 4 priorities for nature recovery for the Skiddaw project. The first is to create 620 hectares of Atlantic rainforest, and this will cover about 20% of Skiddaw forest. And again, I've got a picture of gnarled trees similar to what Guy had earlier, because I can't put enough emphasis on, because Skiddaw is so high and so exposed, we are expecting the trees to be quite small and really gnarled, rather than this like massive forest that will really blend in seamlessly with the landscape. And I'll talk a bit more about that shortly, but our second priority on the next slide is to restore peat bog to a healthy and functioning condition. This will help lock away carbon and reduce the flood risk downstream. And then our third priority is to improve heathland by returning alpine plants like juniper and a variety of willow species that are currently almost entirely absent from English uplands. So you tend to only find them at the moment in the gills and crags, but in reality they should be sort of just below the summit and create this natural gradient from the top of the hillside down to the bottom of the valley. And that's something we're hoping to restore, is that natural succession. And then finally, we're going to be working to preserve the historic heritage of the site and the cultural importance. So we're not going to be changing any of the current access routes, and we're not creating any new fences. We're just going to be replacing and maintaining the current ones. So back onto like the Atlantic Rainforest side, which is what I'm working on. So I'm growing the trees for the Skiddaw project. I started last July, and then in autumn, I've been going out with volunteers. I have about 40 volunteers that are absolutely amazing, and we've been going out and collecting native seeds from all over the Lake District, and species such as rowan, hawthorn, birch, and oak. And we've been collecting from high up locations so that they'll be adapted to survive at the high altitude that we're planting at Skiddaw. And then once we've collected the seeds, if you go to the next slide, we've been doing seed processing, and this varies a bit between species. So some species like oak are really easy, and you just put the acorn straight in the ground. What you can see on this slide is some of the trickier species. So you've got rowan berries on the left, where we have to mash them up first and put them through sieves. It's really quite good fun. And then on the right is crab apples, and we had to individually with a knife cut each crab apple, which is about this big, it's very small, and pick the seeds out. And that bucket you see there of crab apples is all the crab apples we got through, and then the little cup is all the seeds we had left. And in that tiny cup is over 3,000 seeds, even if it doesn't look like it. So yeah, it's a lot of manpower, and I couldn't do it without the help of my colleagues and volunteers. Um, and then so on the next slide, the next step we've been doing is tree growing. So we're growing trees at a number of different locations in the Lake District. This picture is Plumgas, our headquarters, which is just outside of Kendal. And we're getting in some new facilities soon, which is really exciting. So next to where that little greenhouse is, we're going to have a bigger greenhouse, and we're getting a potting shed in, we're getting some raised beds, all of these facilities to create a tree nursery. And then we've also got a site at Cold Springs Community Reserve in Penrith. Gosling Syke in Carlisle is growing some trees for us. And then we're working with Growing Well at T-Bay, which is absolutely amazing. And then we're hoping to get another tree nursery in the Keswick area. So lots and lots going on in terms of the growing. And then finally, once we've grown all these trees, on the next slide, we can get to tree planting. So the tree planting will be winter this year at the earliest. So none of the tree seed has actually germinated yet. Hopefully we get some germination in spring. I'd be so excited to see some little green shoots coming up. And there'll be plenty of volunteering opportunities for that as well. So just on to the next slide, following on from that. The best way to find out about volunteering opportunities, if you are interested, is on our website, or even better, be a member. There'll be lots to do in terms of seed collecting, tree growing, and then the tree planting itself, and also practical conservation activities on site. And finally, I'm just gonna plug our fundraiser for Skiddaw. We are still raising funds, and we really can't do it without you. So we really appreciate anything that you can give. So thank you very much if you already have as well. And then any questions? I think we've got some in the chat popping up.
Thank you so much for that, Izzy. It's super exciting being part of this project. Like, you can obviously tell you are super excited about it, and I think everybody at the trust is as well. Like, it's just such an amazing thing to be involved with, and we're really, really proud and grateful that so many people have helped us with this project. So thank you very much if you're one of those people. Yeah, so let's get to some questions. Guy, I'm so sorry, I'm not sure which ones you've already answered, so I don't know if you want to have a look through and pick a few more out. But shall we take some for Izzy? I don't know if you...
I can't see the questions.
I will read some
I
out.
left before.
Okay. I don't know if you know, what are the chances of getting lichens typical of the Atlantic hazelwood up at Skiddaw? Will it involve translocation?
You can translocate lichens. It has been some, but I think some will be a bit trickier because you can kind of get some that don't like to be moved around as much. I don't know too much about lichens. That's a really interesting question.
I don't know if, Guy, you want to jump in if you know any more about this.
I think I answered a previous question about translocation, which is as Izzy's just said, it's really difficult to do. I mean, in terms of sort of Atlantic hazelwood, I mean, in terms of that hazel gloves fungus that I showed you a picture of earlier, the really orange fungus, I was quite excited. I mean, this shows you how much of a geek I am. I was quite excited that a conservationist found hazel gloves fungus for the first time in Cumbria not so long ago, in Nadel Forest. So it's definitely in the broader area. I don't know how quickly it could send its spores over towards Skiddaw to colonize any old hazels that you might have there. But I think it is sort of cropping up in more and more places. It used to be just sort of talked about as being only in the west coast of Scotland, but I found, and various actual botanists have found lots of examples of it in the west of kind of Cornwall and Devon. So that's one species that can travel quite far, I think.
Izzy, somebody's asking, how many trees will you expect to plant in total? I'm going to say a lot, but I'll let you elaborate on that.
Yeah, it is a lot. So we need to plant 300,000 trees in 100 years, which isn't really a number that you can visualize. But for extra context, that will mean in some ways planting about double that, which means me growing about double that, which means me collecting about double that, because at all of these stages we're going to be experiencing loss. So a lot of trees.
And I'm assuming at some point you'll be handing that job over to somebody else as well. Unless you're planning to be here for the next 100 years. I don't know.
Oh, maybe I could be here for the next
Maybe you will.
100 years.
Let's have a look. Dun, dun, dun. Thank you very much, everybody, by the way, for your questions. I'm just having a read down. Once you get started, will natural processes pick up and spread the forest further, or does that take too long when there are so few mature trees present? Any thoughts on that?
There is a lot to be said for natural regeneration here. So on site, there are already a few birches and a few rowans that are there, but a lot of those are actually a little bit lower than we'd like to plant, which is why we do also need to do planting, and there's certain species that aren't there that we'll have to bring to Skiddaw. And so yes, to some extent, natural regeneration will also speed up as we plant more trees. But also we really are going to have to give it a helping hand. So one of the sort of models we're looking at is Carafran in Scotland, which is just over the border. It's an absolutely amazing site, and their website is really good as well. You can check it out and see the difference. They've got these pictures of 1 year of the project versus 5 years of a project, and it's a completely different site. And so they experienced where it took quite a few years before things kicked off because the soil was quite poor, and we've got a similar thing going on at Skiddaw where the soil is quite poor. So we really will have to give these trees a helping hand to make sure that they succeed. So it's unfortunately natural regeneration isn't going to fully do the whole job for us.
Edward is asking us if we can buy a proportion of trees as shrubs or if we can source them from further south. Izzy, I don't know if you want to lean in on that one. No, because she's gone again. I'm sorry about this, everybody. We have had a few technical issues tonight. I think it's probably best if we leave it there, considering Izzy has left us once again. But I will say thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this evening. Please do donate to the Skiddaw Forest Project if you haven't already, or even if you have already, because we really appreciate your donations. I think we're about halfway to our £600,000 restoration fundraiser. So which is fantastic considering we've already raised £1.5 million for the purchase of Skiddaw itself, so that's wonderful. Just a few bits to end with. I'll send you all a recording of this talk probably tomorrow via email, as well as a bit more information about what we've talked about today. And if you do have any more questions about Skiddaw, please do feel free to respond to that email, and I'll pass them on to the best person to answer, which is probably Izzy or our head of nature reserves, Joe. So yeah, guys, anything else you'd like to say just to round off the talk before we go, or just bye?
All I would just say is, obviously, please, all of you, if you haven't already, do chip into the Skiddaw Fund and support, as I'm sure you're doing already, Cumbria Wildlife Trust. But can I also urge everyone to continue taking political action on rainforests? And, you know, we have had a new government for the last 6 months. They haven't said very much on temperate rainforests yet, if anything at all. They haven't said a huge amount on nature generally, and I think we need to get them to say a lot more. So please do talk to your MPs and you know, keep pushing the government, so they keep pushing political action on this as well. I'd love there to be a revamped government rainforest strategy that sets a really clear target to double the area of temperate rainforest in England, and to link up with Scottish and Welsh governments to do that across Britain as well. So yeah, that would be my final plug. But obviously, principally, support the Skiddaw project.
Thank you very much, Guy. Excellent plugs all around. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening. We'll end the talk there. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks all. Bye.